We're all spending a lot more time indoors these days, but the funny thing is, that's really no different than usual. Studies show that we spend 90% of our lives indoors, and that was before we were all afraid of grocery stores. Our next guest, Emily Anthes, is a journalist who's written a new book on the science of what all the inside time means for our health. In this talk, she'll present some cutting-edge research and examine how seemingly small design details can alter outcomes, like cognitive performance, immune health, and appetite for food. Please join me in welcoming Emily Anthes.
My name is Emily Anthes, and I am a science journalist and author of the new book, The Great Indoors: The Surprising Science of How Buildings Shape Our Behavior, Health, and Happiness. Today, I'm going to take you through a few of the big lessons from the book, particularly those that illustrate the importance of the field known as evidence-based design. First, though, I'm going to start by telling you a story about a hospital in Pennsylvania, a 200-bed hospital. And in the 1970s and 80s, the hospital looked like this. This is one wing of the hospital, an inpatient wing, where patients would recover from surgery. As you can see along this corridor, the patient rooms all look pretty similar, but there was one big difference between the rooms on this wing. Half of the rooms had windows that looked out onto this grove of trees, a nice natural view that patients could gaze at as they recovered from surgery. The other half of the rooms, however, looked out onto a brick wall, which is maybe not the most pleasant thing to be seeing day in and day out after a surgery. In the early 1980s, a pioneering researcher named Roger Ulrich got curious about this difference and began to wonder whether the view that patients had out of their hospital windows might make some difference in how they recovered. So he went and looked through the medical records of a few dozen patients, all of whom had had their gallbladders out at this hospital and who had been randomly assigned rooms along this corridor. He found significant differences in their recoveries. As it turns out, patients who had views of the trees and the nice natural landscapes used fewer doses of strong painkillers and were even discharged from the hospital about a day sooner than those who had views of a brick wall. So nature, it seemed, at least in this context, really could be healing. Ulrich wrote up these findings in a paper that he published in 1984 in Science, which is one of the most prestigious and prominent peer-reviewed journals there is. And they made a splash at the time. And the publication of this paper is now often cited as the birth of the new field that became known as evidence-based design. So evidence-based design is a broad term. It's a bit of an umbrella term. But what it refers to is the use of data, research, peer-reviewed studies to create spaces that can achieve some sort of outcome. So that could be a hospital where patients recover faster, or a classroom where students learn better, or an office where employees are more productive. All of these things can fall under the category of evidence-based design as long as designers are pulling upon and applying data to their designs. Why does evidence-based design matter? Well, modern humans are essentially an indoor species. We spend roughly 90% of our lives indoors, and evidence-based design gives us tools that we can use to create spaces that boost our health and well-being and improve our lives. So the big takeaway from my book is that indoor spaces shape nearly every aspect of our lives in profound and sometimes surprising ways. So I'm going to take you through a few examples of the impact that different elements of the built environment can have on us. First is nature, which we've begun to talk about a little bit already. That's what Ulrich was interested in his hospital study, whether a view of nature could be healing. There's now a lot of really solid evidence that nature can have all sorts of benefits for our bodies. To name just a few, it can reduce pain, reduce stress, reduce blood pressure, and even boost our immune systems. Of course, we're here to talk about indoor spaces and the built environment. So to really harness the power of nature, we need to figure out ways to bring it indoors. The good news is that it seems that almost any kind of nature really seems to do the trick. So views of the natural world from your windows in your buildings or your homes, those can be therapeutic. but so can houseplants, and so can even things like photos of nature or soundtracks. Playing nature sounds over speakers or into your headphones can have some of the same stress-relieving benefits as actually being out in the real thing. What makes nature so potent? A lot of researchers explain it with what's known as the biophilia hypothesis. And this hypothesis holds that because of how we evolved out in the rough and tumble of nature, we have an innate affinity for and attraction to the natural world. And so as a result, nature serves as sort of a positive distraction, catching our eye and our interest and taking our minds off of any stress or pain or anxiety that we might be feeling in that moment. Nature, though, is not just good for the body, it's also good for the mind. And there are a number of studies now that show that incorporating nature into our built and indoor environments can boost learning, productivity, attention, and memory. There's one interesting study that shows, for instance, that students who go to school in classrooms that have views of the natural world or some sort of natural landscape actually have higher test scores than students whose classrooms look out onto blacktops or parking lots or other elements of the man-made world. Scientists explain these benefits with what's known as attention restoration theory. And the idea is that the tasks of modern living, of our everyday lives, are cognitively taxing. They use up a lot of our mental resources. Looking at nature, on the other hand, is a more sort of effortless kind of engagement. And so it allows our brains to take a break, and our minds to rest. And then when we return to whatever it is we were doing, our attention and our focus have been restored and our minds have been recharged a little bit. Daylight is another absolutely essential component to bring into our indoor environments. And one of the reasons daylight is so important is because it's what helps keep our internal clocks set to the right time or our circadian rhythm sort of in sync with the solar day. We know that it's exposure to lots of daylight, particularly in the morning, that helps keep us alert during the day and also helps us sleep better at night. And daylight, it turns out, has a lot of benefits that are similar to nature. There are studies that show that students who go to school in sunny classrooms have higher test scores than those in dark ones. Likewise, patients in sunny hospital rooms fare better than those in shady ones. They use fewer painkillers, report less stress, are discharged sooner, and even, in one study, seem to have lower mortality rates. Ventilation is another absolutely critical component of our indoor environments, especially right now when we are all worried about a respiratory pandemic. Ventilation is something that's really important to think about in terms of safeguarding our health. And in fact, increasing ventilation and bringing in more air from the outdoors does provide protection from both infectious disease and indoor air pollution. When you increase the supply of outdoor air, what you're doing is diluting and dispersing any pathogens that might be in the air, as well as any indoor air pollutants. And that can have a variety of downstream health benefits for us. It can also have cognitive benefits. And one of the reasons why is because one of the most potent indoor air pollutants is actually carbon dioxide, which we exhale every time we breathe. And if we're in rooms that are crowded or poorly ventilated, carbon dioxide can build up to levels that are high enough to actually impair our thinking. That might explain why you see so many bad ideas in stuffy, overcrowded conference rooms at the end of long meetings. But studies show that if you increase the ventilation rate and bring in more air from outdoors, you can actually boost people's performance on a battery of cognitive tests. Layout, or the way that spaces are connected to each other, can have a really powerful influence on our behavior. And some of the most interesting studies of this come from workplaces, and particularly from a company known as Humanize, which is a workplace analytics company based outside of Boston. And what they do is they study how employees interact with each other, both digitally and face-to-face. One of their products is known as a Sociometric Badge, and it's loaded with all kinds of electronics that track when colleagues or employees are having face-to-face conversations with each other. Humanize has used these badges in a variety of tests, and it's allowed them to make a couple of conclusions. The first is that despite the rapid adoption of technologies like Slack and other digital messaging software and tools, face-to-face communication really remains the gold standard. And teams that have more face-to-face interactions are more productive and have higher performance, especially on complicated or tricky tasks. Secondarily, they've found that physical proximity is one of the best ways to foster this interaction. We're more likely to converse with people who have desks that are close to ours. That might sound kind of obvious and intuitive, but it can have really interesting and powerful downstream effects. And that's something that Human Eyes found in one of its case studies. It worked with a European bank that wanted to find out why some of its branches were underperforming. So Human Eyes used its badges and studied the communication patterns of the bank's employees. And what it found was that employees in the highest performing branches were having more face-to-face interaction than those in the lower performing branches. They found something else really interesting too. And that was that in some of the low-performing branches, employees seemed to sort themselves into two distinct social groups, and members of each group rarely communicated with each other. When they went to look at these branches in more detail, it became pretty apparent pretty quickly what was happening. These were two-floor locations, and employees on the first floor were rarely going up the stairs to talk to their colleagues on the second floor, and vice versa. It only took a few minutes to go up and down the stairs, but during a busy workday, people just weren't doing it. And so as a result, it was circumscribing their social networks and presumably impairing their productivity. After discovering this, the bank put a new practice into place and began systematically and periodically rotating employees, moving them between floors to expand their social networks. And the data showed that in the year after the company started doing this, sales at these branches increased by 11%. Smaller design decisions can matter a lot too. Behavioral economists have demonstrated that we can steer people towards certain choices by altering the way those choices are presented. So anyone who's ever kept a jar or bag of candy on their desk knows that we are more likely to consume food when it's within easy reach. And so the idea then is that we might be able to encourage better eating habits by making healthy food more accessible and convenient and making junk food less accessible and convenient. My favorite demonstration of this comes from a study of a California elementary school. It was conducted in 2013. And typically at this school, students had a choice between chocolate and plain milk. And usually both milk choices were available right in front of the lunch counter. There was a crate of chocolate milk and a crate of plain milk, and students could just reach in and grab whichever one they preferred. But for 1 week, researchers tried an experiment. They hid the chocolate milk behind the lunch counter and put up a sign that said, "If you want chocolate milk, please ask." Students weren't forbidden from taking chocolate milk. They weren't discouraged from it. They just had to go out of their way to ask for it. And this one change led to a big spike in the number of students who were selecting plain milk, a healthier choice. All of these examples demonstrate, I hope, how powerful the indoor environment can be. But there are also a few caveats. And one of them is that environments are complex, and different variables and factors can interact in complicated and sometimes unanticipated ways. In one recent study, for instance, researchers found that when an office was dark, noisy, or cold, employees had more complaints about the air quality, even though the air quality didn't change at all. Likewise, another study found that when the noise in a room increased, volunteers were less satisfied with the air temperature. So our impressions of one aspect of the indoor environment can really color our overall impressions of the space. The second caveat is that people are complex. And so there's no such thing as an ideal environment for everyone or for everything. A workplace that's designed for one type of task or industry might be terrible for workers in another industry. To give one example, there are studies that suggest that light that's on the cooler, bluer end of the spectrum is best for boosting alertness and for enhancing our ability to multitask. Light, on the other hand, that's on the warmer, more amber-colored side of the spectrum seems to be ideal for enhancing creativity and might be a better choice for workplaces where that's a major component of the job. Then, of course, we all have different needs, preferences, and sensitivities. Anyone who's ever worked in an office is probably familiar with the office thermostat wars, where a temperature that feels balmy and comfortable to one employee is absolutely frigid to another. And in general, research suggests that women are more sensitive to changes in air temperature and to prefer slightly warmer air temperature than men do. And in fact, a recent study suggests that this is not just a matter of comfort or preference, that women actually perform better on cognitive tasks when the air temperature is slightly higher. As a result, a lot of modern offices, which tend to be calibrated to men's thermal preferences, might actually be making it more difficult for women to perform at their peak. So while there are a lot of general principles that can help us design healthier spaces, there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all environment. And design in general, and evidence-based design in particular, is not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but it can open new possibilities and nudge our behaviors and lives in healthier directions and improve our mood and happiness and well-being. And it can help us build an infrastructure upon which we build a better future. Thank you.